everybody. It's a really pleasure to be here, and I will sit here because I know there's a camera pointed at me. If I start to get up, I walk all over the place, and that would be lethal for the recording purposes. So, but again, I appreciate Jean-Marc extending an invitation for me to come, and to the department and the university for facilitating this visit. My French is almost non-existent, so I'm going to have to resort instead to the other Canadian language, English. And so I hope you will bear with me as I move through this talk. Apropos of nothing, I am a great fan of Canada. I believe if one really believed in having multiple lives, which I don't, but you know, if that were actually true, I think I was a Canadian in an earlier life, because it's just, I love coming to Canada. It's one of the most spectacular countries on the globe, and you're also given given American policies on a variety of issues. This is one of the more sane countries certainly on the continent, in the world, frankly. So we look to Canada with envy on a whole host of issues. So it's very nice to be here, however briefly. Indeed, as Colette mentioned, I've over a career have studied just about every facet of communicating science to the public that I could drum up. But I began my career, once I left science writing, began my career as a social scientist, studying scientists and journalists and the interactions of those groups. Partly because, having been a science journalist, that was of just great interest to me, to better understand the dynamics of those interactions. Once I got into the business of journalism in an academic way and began looking for money to do research, I was pulled into what we call in the United States effects research, which again, all the money in the US is literally available to study the impacts of messages on audiences. And there was a fair amount of money available for those kinds of things too, particularly in the world of communicating risk information to audiences. And so I veered off in that area and has spent a good bit of the last 20 years or so doing research on audiences rather than on the producers of information. But it's been a treat recently to come back into this production side, working most recently with somebody who some of you met earlier in this lecture series, Hans-Peter Peters, from Jülich in Germany, and he and I have collaborated on a variety of projects over the years and are working on a new one at this point, exploring the ways in which he may have even talked about this in his talk, the ways in which neuroscientists of all groups react to public visibility and react to media coverage of their work in ways that might even affect the way they do research. And we'll be looking at those interactions both in the United States and Germany over the next year. So it's a pleasure to be back into this world of how information is being produced and being able to look once again at scientists and journalists. The talk I want to give you today is not I'm not focusing on an original research project, but on the results of a program of research over the years, things that I've learned through individual projects. And what I like to do when I give talks is tell stories about about research. And so you won't see data here, but underneath all of this, and I'll try to refer to occasional studies as I go, are a lot of data, both mine and the work of a lot of other people. I want to talk about this whole area of contested science. Again, the ways in which journalists deal with it, the things that influence the choices that they make as they try to publicize controversial material. They run into a lot of roadblocks and a lot of issues that they're not even aware of sometimes. And I think it's a really fascinating area for study. As you know, let's see if we can get this guy to move. If I hit the button, there, okay. Almost all science is contested in one way or another. You're hard-pressed to find an area of science about which scientists fail to disagree. There's a double negative. Is that hard to understand or what? So scientists disagree in almost all cases. There are a number of issues that are far more public than others. I don't know if you're wrestling with this in Canada, but a major, major controversy in the United States now is the argument among many interest groups in our country that vaccines are linked to autism diagnoses in children. And here's an ad that reflects that assumption. That's really extraordinarily controversial, and like so many controversies, it's having a material impact. The herd immunity in the United States for certain kinds of diseases is now declining, and we're getting, for example, whooping cough epidemics because sufficiently few children in some communities are now not vaccinated for these kinds of diseases. So there are real health repercussions from these kinds of controversies. In this case, and again, if you follow these sorts of things, the best evidence we have right now is that there is no link between autism and vaccines. But one of the truly difficult elements of these controversies is that there is now a subset of individuals, many much more powerful than others, who have extremely strong beliefs in this link. And when you get situations like that, your ability as a journalist to cover this material is really presents major challenges, which I'll talk about a little bit later. You all have your own controversies here in Quebec. One of them, which you can't see from this little one, it's a very dark picture. These are shale gas workmen. And again, I've been fascinated to read more about the development of shale gas in Quebec. You're not too far away from what appear to be major fields, if you want to think of them as fields of this stuff. And again, I don't know how strong these controversies have become at this point, but it is a world where, again, there will be ongoing debates about what to value most, the jobs that get produced from the development of these fields and the equipment that you have to develop in order to frack this stuff, and the environmental issues, as well as the human issues that sit on the other side of that continuum. I was just reading in one of my science magazines from a couple weeks ago about the situation in Germany, where the Germans have been pushing alternate energy forms for a long time. If you visit Germany, you're confronted with one wind generator after another. At the same time, parts of Germany are sitting on enormous amounts of the dirtiest coal in the world. It's called brown coal, and they're going after it. This is the world of controlling carbon dioxide increases globally is going to, I think, require us to figure out ways to use coal in a more responsible manner. Some people talk about divesting ourselves of coal entirely. I've yet to see some analyses that make that possible. It would be great. But Germany, in spite of all of their alternative energy strategies, is now mining brown coal and is engaged in displacing entire towns in order to get at this stuff. And so it's a very interesting saga that we don't hear much about, and I'm wondering about the shale gas situation in Canada and the accompanying social tensions there too. You know, the granddaddy of all controversial science arenas these days is global warming. And again, this one gets a lot of attention, both by researchers and by journalists. And again, there are countless mini controversies as well. As I say, almost any arena of science you stare at will be contested in one way or another. What I want to do is talk about how these things get covered and what some of the strengths and weaknesses of that coverage might be. The general approach to controversy and to journalists covering controversy is to focus on that coverage as an inherently bad thing. Okay, I don't know again about Canada, but certainly in the United States, there's a generic assumption that journalistic coverage of controversy is something that policymakers worry about, something that we should all worry about. And the oops. Okay, let me pull up that little thingy. And there are a number of reasons why that's probably so. One is the argument that journalists manufacture controversy, that it's an attention getter, and so controversy can be created where it doesn't exist. Another argument is that when controversy exists, that journalists overplay it by this all too familiar term, by sensationalizing information. One thing that's really interesting to do, incidentally, as a scholar, is when we get a lot of this critique in the United States, a lot of scientists talking about writers and journalists sensationalizing the science. When somebody says that, ask them what they mean by the word sensationalizing. And you'll find if you ask across a variety of individuals, you don't get the same answer. Okay? Nobody really knows what that word means. All we know is that it's a way of saying this is a bad idea. Okay? So that's another critique that you see.